start talking about our next topic. Obviously, the roster change window has
Ooh.
recently closed, and boy, oh boy, have there been quite a bit of, I don't know, swaps.
Yeah, so many
Word for word.
things that were happening with like the last couple of days of the season where it was like a domino effect really where one person moves to the team and they're off the team, but they're still a really good player, so another team wants them, so they have to remove a good player, so the other team wants them, so it's just kind of when one happens, the other happens, but if one doesn't happen, it doesn't none of it happens. Which is exactly
Yeah,
what happened because Rise was gonna go to V1 out of Moist. Actually, he was supposed to go to Oxygen and then V1, and then he ended up going to Oxygen. But for a while, it looked like we're gonna have the craziest NA circuit ever this season split.
Yeah, that if
I,
that move would have happened, North America, like everyone was talking about how North America was already the craziest region in Split 1, but going into the winter split, if Rise was here too, and then Calm to Optic, and then everything else, and then lost to Fury, like all those different moves would have been insane. However, none of that happened.
Yeah.
So the question is, or I guess the question I would have for you guys, I want to know your opinion on it, is in regards to this split, do you think the roster moves that didn't happen will mess up those teams, like the Optic and the V1? Do you think it'll throw off those teams?
wholeheartedly, you cannot convince me that the mindset on V1 now that Com is still there is anything but
And
in the garbage can.
Optic. You don't understand Optic because Magic Bear, they
Yeah,
they
and
they,
Optic, well,
they were talking about how he was like the next good thing. Redo said a couple months on Twitter like they're not gonna let any other team take him, and the second that one new free agent comes along, they are literally looking to replace him within like a day of the roster leaving. Like that is like backstabbing at its finest.
it,
So
it's
look
so.
at
I
that.
feel so bad for Magic Bear, man. I mean,
Yeah,
I feel like that dude can't catch a break.
They've been babying him all season too. Like if you listen to their comms and how they talk, but they kind of treat him like a little brother. Like, hey, it's completely okay if you mess up and all that type of stuff. It's completely fine. Like they're still treating him not as an equal teammate, but as like just somebody who they can win with. But they treat him like it doesn't matter if he mess up. For example, compare that to Gen G. Is Chronic a little brother to those teams? No, that they are three equal players. Now, some players have like Noli and Appjack. They do have more experience, but they treat each other as equal players. If you bring Chronic to that fall major and you treat him as much as Reddles and AJ treated Magic Bear, they aren't making it past the Swiss stage. I mean, I could see them losing to Power if they had that mindset first round. So yeah, like
yeah.
it's honestly insane how they're treating like especially Magic Bear. But like I hear a lot of people talking about like Calm, where he might start to be a little bit more individualistic. Like he knows he's on the chopping block. He might honestly just start trying to pop off and kind of almost carry the team in a way, which could hurt the team, but it could show to other teams that he knows how to play the game, if that makes sense. Whereas with Magic Bear, I feel like it could go either way, where now his confidence is completely shot, and he's just going to play even worse since he was already treated poorly because of how Reddles and AJ treated him as a teammate. But now he knows he's on the chopping block too. So it's either Magic Bear is going to realize it doesn't matter, I'm just going to do whatever I want and maybe become the best player on the team, or is he going to fall off completely?
I I wanted to talk about that because the move to take away Calm seemed very interesting to me because I feel like Torment has been not necessarily the most impactful player on V1. Like he's always kind of been there as a super stable player, but I feel like his play isn't very impactful. And with Calm, you can literally see his presence on the field because he's constantly chasing demos. He's constantly maybe trash talking the other team actually in person. So he has a very big impact on the actual field and in the game. And so if they're gonna replace anybody, I always thought that it was gonna be Torment and have Calm still on the team. So makes for, as you said, an interesting dynamic between the three players.
Yeah, I'm with Benji on that. I would not have pinned Com to be the guy that they're gonna replace. I firmly believed that Torment. I don't feel like Torment is anywhere near like what Torment used to be. I mean, I feel like Torment
Yeah.
is just a placeholder at this point. I'm not saying he's bad and he's throwing games. It's just I don't feel like he's making near as much of an impact as what we know Torment used to do. Um,
Yeah.
but I don't know. That's just my opinion. But and I also said that I feel like the mental would be shot on V1, and I was saying that kind of like over Optic, but I feel like that's specifically because I just this may just be a random like gut feeling, but I just feel like the overall mental on V1 is so much worse than the overall mental on Optic, even though that there are those issues with Reddles and AJ not treating Magic Bear as a full part of the team is an equal player. I don't know. That's just my gut feeling. I can't imagine that Com's sitting there screaming at other children across a stage and then they lose and like there's not just an awkward talk afterwards. I can't imagine that that's like, oh man, like good try, like.
Yeah.
It seems like funny to me. Like if you're gonna be like trash talking and you win, like then I feel like nobody questions it. But if you're
Yeah.
sitting there like screaming and chasing demos and then you lose that series, especially if it's a series that you are not the underdog in and you get upset, then I feel like that's just gonna be awkward afterwards. You're like that kid that what saves you in the middle of a game and then you come back and absolutely blow him out and then he just insta leaves and never says anything back to you. They're like, that's embarrassing,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think for me, my opinion might differ on the V1 situation. In my opinion, I think at the spring major and at this major, I think Torment was the best performing player on V1, in my personal opinion. At the World Championship, Beast Mode didn't look really good, but Calm looked consistent at the World Championship. But then the only like series where Beast Mode like popped off and people would say he was the best player on V1 was that series against FaZe, and they still lost in 7, right? Because FaZe just can only get top 4, right? They have to get top 4, so V1 kind of got fourth killer, yeah. So so when it comes to like Beast Mode, he's only ever had one good series on LAN. Like, of course, he gets them to the majors, right? And I think that's where they have to question like where they set their priorities straight. Because Calm, he's normally like Calm has up and downs at majors, but he's normally better than Beast Mode on LAN. And then Torment is arguably the best player on LAN, except for those like maybe 1-2 series where Beast Mode pops off. But at the end of the day, if those series where he pops off are just in the group stages, then they're not going to be winning any majors. So the question is like, why is Beast Mode not able to perform? Like, some players say that some players just aren't LAN players. However, if you look at that secret series, Torment was carrying that team. Beast Mode couldn't touch the ball. Calm couldn't touch the ball. It was literally just Torment. When it comes to LANs, if you remove Torment, let's say you have Calm, Beast Mode, and say another third, like who else would someone say? Maybe a Daniel or something similar to that. Like, I don't think they would do as well because Calm and Beast Mode are inconsistent on LAN. And you would think Calm would be the most consistent because his playstyle, I mean, it's on 0 ping. Demos aren't going to lag. You're essentially free to do whatever you want. And that's why, in my personal opinion, if they were to get rid of somebody, for LAN, it would be somebody for Beast Mode, just because for someone more consistent. Like, I think, say, a Daniel instead of Beast Mode in that roster might actually do better. That's, of course, all hypothetical, but it's just a fact. Beast Mode can't perform on LAN except for that one series. And you never know what series is going to show up.
Yeah.
Fair enough. I can get behind like most of what you're saying. Not all of it, but I think you talk about like like Beast Mode couldn't touch the ball and Calm couldn't touch the ball. I feel like Calm doesn't even care about the ball in like 60% of the game. He is so much, but he counters that with so much off ball pressure that he can get away with a lot. Like Calm can get away with so much less on ball pressure because he on the flip side has so much more off ball pressure than I think 99.9% of players in RLCS do.
Yeah, and he's still mechanical as well. Like, a lot of
Oh,
people,
yeah,
like, people think of him as demos, but when he first came onto the scene, he was Mr. Mechanics. He was the only 1v1 player who you ever saw really going for musties in the air, double flip resets, anything sort of mechanical. And even at the only 1v1 LAN in existence, he actually, I believe he almost scored a pogo goal or something similar as well. Like, he was extremely mechanical. It's just, yeah, V1's a very interesting. I wouldn't be surprised if the whole V1 roster by next season is just completely different. Like, only one. Like, I assume V1 would do whatever they could to keep Beast Mode on that roster, no matter what, just because of who he is. But I wouldn't be surprised if it was just one of those players on V1 by next season.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the depth of EU, because I feel like EU is falling kind of apart here. We have maybe 3 top teams. I was thinking of Oxygen, Moist, which Moist, I don't really know what happened to Moist because they had a really bad actual online, and they came and did a really, really good major. But I feel like Auction and Moist are the only two contenders for him because BDS has fallen apart recently, and they didn't make any roster moves, which kind of reminds me of NRG where, they keep falling apart. They're gonna try and rebuild, but they can't get it going. Then they're gonna have to make a roster move eventually. But I think that finally, with the help from a couple of EU pros, NA is finally outmatching EU with the amount of depth we have because of how many teams we have that consistently play good, and the amount of teams that on a good day could be one of the top teams in the region.
Yeah, for me, at least by what I've analyzed as a coach and everything like that, for the last season or two, I've been more against people saying that NA or EU has more depth, but I trying to think, talking teams of what's their floor, what's their average, and what's their ceiling. Like for me, EU's average and floor when it comes to their play style and how they play the game is very, very low in my personal opinion. But their ceiling is, I think as a region, their ceiling is the highest. They're super fast, super mechanical, and I think it's mostly due to EU having a way higher population than compared to even North America. So they just have so many players that's raising that mechanical skill ceiling that they're just such fast teams, and the way they play, they just look for passes and speed and everything like that more than anything else. Which is why when you go to those lands and you play against these other teams that might be a little bit slower, a little bit more hesitating, especially in the early rounds of Swiss, which is normally when we see EU dominate, like that's where you see all those passes really come to fruition. But at the end of the day, if they're not playing at their peak, they honestly look horrible. I mean, look at the EU regionals. I'm gonna be completely honest. In a professional scene, the 16th best team should not be taking a series off the best team in the region. Like that's not depth, in my personal opinion. If you're the best team in the region, you got the best practice, you got the most money, you got the most drive to improve, you get to go across the world, play at international lands, and then your first regional back in the new split, you're losing to a 16th best team. Like, that's just not supposed to happen. That's why when it looks at EU, the playstyle shows it, the standings show it. They're inconsistent, in my personal opinion. I mean, this could even be shown, this is kind of strawmanning it, but even looking at the CRL World Championship, we had EU semi-pros and pros at that World Championship, and they're losing to rank B+ players in North America on land. Like, that's kind of strawmanning it, or it is strawmanning a little bit, but it does bring the question of, like, even outside the RLCS scene, they're losing to non-semi-pros. Like, the semi-pros are losing to non-semi-pros in North America. It's just like, it doesn't match up to me. Whereas as for, like, North America, I think the ceiling is honestly the ceilings on North American teams are pretty low, except for G2. And the main reason why I say that is just because a lot of teams focus on empty nets in North America. You look at SSG, where are most of their goals? Empty net goals, and they're normally created off of demos and everything like that. The only teams that don't do that are Gen G and G2. G2, like Gen G, they still look for passes, but they still clear the net, so to speak, while going for it, which is why I think they're still a little bit more consistent than G2. But G2, they essentially try to make the perfect pass and the perfect shot every time. And they have a system that makes it so they get a lot of shots and a lot of passes, but look at the World Championship. They put a pass mid, they shoot it on a net of 3 defenders, and if the shot was good, it goes in, like online. They get that perfect pass, doesn't matter how many defenders are in net, they're scoring. But I guess the World Championship nerves really mess them up because they get that perfect pass, same as online, but they hit it off the crossbar every single time. Which led for me, G2 have a really high ceiling, and online, they're able to play at that ceiling. But once it comes to LAN, that's where you really see the floor of G2, because of their playstyle. It requires perfection with G2. Very similar to BDS, in my opinion.
I agree. I mean, that's why you see BDS, beating G2 in the grand finals, and then BDS turns around and then just falls apart. BDS is so inconsistent, but it's like you're talking about. I think their floor is just below the ground.
Yeah.
I think, but their peak is so high. I mean, we know that Monkey Moon is legitimately, as far as like peak level, peak ability, is like hands down like top 3 players in the world. Like, I don't think there's anybody that puts Monkey Moon outside of their top 3.
Yeah, I think they're doing the top 20 players of the year, and I think I wouldn't be surprised if he gets a top 3, even though for basically half the year he has not been here. So he's just that good that the time that he was at his peak, he's still considered even now that he was one of the best players of the year, which is kind of wild.
Yeah, definitely. Like looking at EU overall, just seeing like that's why it's just like I think it's a really good thing because having a high ceiling is not a bad thing. Having a low floor and a high ceiling isn't a bad thing. If anything, it shows that on your best day, you are the better region. If EU on their best day are the better region. But the thing is, you're not able to play at your best day every single match every single day. Which is why when you look at the more consistent play styles in North America, and how these players play together, like consistency almost always wins at the end of the day. I mean, we saw at the beginning of RLCS, EU won how many? They run Season 2 through Season 5 World Championships, but then after North America finally got consistent enough with their mechanics and everything like that, they weren't as fast as EU teams. They didn't have the same play style, but they were starting to beat those EU teams. Season 7, only Vitality made it through, and Vitality were peaking on that final day. G2 beat them in group stage, and Vitality just swept through the bracket on the final day. And then Season 8, Vitality as well didn't have a good league play at all, but they make it to the World Championship. And they get second place. They could have knocked out NRG, and we could have seen Garrett G crying over again. Luckily, we didn't get to see that, but like it goes to show that an EU team that peaks can beat anybody. But the thing is, it's very inconsistent.
I agree with you. I share most of that. I kind of just wanted to highlight some of these big roster changes that happen, and if any of these kind of stand out to you guys that you want to touch on, please feel free to stop me. You've Moist, obviously Rise left, and they brought on Rose to replace his spot. KCP got rid of Super Latchy, and it was their coach and their mental coach, right, Luke?
Yeah.
It was I'm slipping on their names.
Yeah, and with Moist, they brought on Juicy for Rise. That's what it was.
Yeah, Juicy. He was playing for Heat, I think.
Yeah, he's playing for Heat.
Juicy.
It's kind of an interesting choice because I didn't see him as like a standout player, especially on a team like Heat, who's just kind of a middle team. But I guess they see something in him. It's kind of like when they Space Station grabbed Daniel. Like, it could have a big effect, but we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I think the bigger connection is when Endpoint picked up Seiko, I think, with Juicy. Because Juicy, he is very young. His first RLCS split was Spring Split last season. He is very mechanical. He's a French player. I mean, at that point, what do you need to hear? He's a French player. That's all I need to hear, really, when it comes to young prodigies in regards to Rocket League. So, like, he's super mechanical, and he's even been showing up on a couple 1v1 show matches recently just with his level of mechanics. Not just mechanics, but defense. I think that's one thing that Moist have been missing since Fatira left is that defensive end of things. So, I mean, we lose one French player that's good at defense. Let's bring in another one that's even more mechanical when it comes to the offensive end. That's essentially what Juicy is. Juicy doesn't have the experience because, sadly, he wasn't able to go to that Gamers 8 LAN. He had to be subbed in by Raziers. But, I mean, Heat, they got top 8 at that LAN, right? Or very close to it with Raziers. Now, imagine if Juicy went to that LAN. Heat could have probably pulled up some big upsets if that was Juicy. So Moist picking up a player like Juicy, in my opinion, I think it's very solid. And yeah, looks like someone in chat saying Juicy took Napo or a Was to game 5. I mean, it doesn't matter who. If they can take one of those players to game 5 in a 1v1, I mean, that's solid stuff from Juicy. And then
absolutely,
in regards to other roster change, I think like the biggest roster change here is the supposed NIP roster. It's going to be here. It's all but announced, I think, at this moment in time. It's confirmed as a roster. Kaio, Astromic, and Bems. And I managed to get to see these guys in scrims the other day. They're very, very consistent. Especially with Kaio on the roster, he's grinding. So getting to see them, I think, well, I know as a roster they're essentially confirmed, but of course it's that NIP if they're going to be signed to NIP or not. So, but this roster is super consistent, and I could see them making a world championship and doing better because I think Kaio's worst performance on LAN was probably Winter Split last season, where he ended up throwing against Queso in that Game 7. He really didn't play well. But then Spring Major, he started to play well, but they ended up losing to Carmine Core. But then World Championship and Gamers 8, Kaio didn't miss a beat. He looked fantastic. I think the biggest question that the people had is online in North America. That's where Kaio didn't look good. And I think that's the main reason why they replaced him. But if Kaio can make it to LAN, we're going to see that man that keeps improving every LAN over and over again.
Absolutely. And yeah, I apologize. Apparently, when you mistype Rise and you put Rose instead, you think it's a completely different player. Um, and that's another thing I wanted to touch on. I'm very hopeful that Ninjas in Pajamas actually come in as an org to represent that roster. Obviously, they're an organization that has been around esports for quite some time. A very big organization that I think it adds more depth to adding to Rocket League as an esports scene as a whole. So obviously, when organizations like that want to get involved, I think it's super awesome. Other rosters to touch on under Vindico, we'll have Yukio, Speed, and Messinaris, which I feel like is probably going to be anticlimactic in my opinion.
Yeah, that's just 3 wash players in my mind.
Yeah,
Yeah,
if you
right?
told me this season 7, I'd be like, whoa, like that's
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
interesting. But this is like season 12 now, essentially. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I again, like Luke said, you told me that years ago, dude. I'd be like, wow, that's going to be a super team. Nowadays, I'm like,
my biggest problem there
okay,
is speed.
I mean, that's cool.
My biggest problem
Yeah.
there is speed. Like speed doesn't grind the game anymore. It's like everyone knows his mentality is shot. I mean, like the whole reason why they kicked Cuxer off the original Liquid roster and hearing stuff about that was horrible. Like, so
I mean,
like,
Speed he used to be one of my favorite players back in, I think, season X when he was on Mouse Sports.
yeah.
Like, that was a really good roster where they had so many potential upsets with Arju, I think, when Scrub
Yeah,
left.
that was
'cause Scrub
season.
had
That was season 8, season 9. Yeah.
Yeah, when Scrub, all that situation happened. So he was like one of those players that you kind of just looked at. He's kind of like a JNAPS for me, where you kind of see him, and back in the day, he kind of just always played to a good level where he was impacting his team. And I mean, JNAPS is still doing that. I think he's the number 11 player this year, which is incredible for a player going on 6 years as being a pro on G2. So, but Speed's definitely fallen off a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Curious on your guys' thoughts on Dignitas picked up Evo, so that'll be Evo, Drees, and Andy.
Mm.
I think Drees and Andy are going to be hard carrying on the game sense side of that of that team. Now, I think if the mentality's good with that roster, I think that they could enable Evo and kind of be similar to that endpoint situation last season in EU. Thing is, I do believe in North America is more consistent in that regard. So I'm thinking maybe Dignitas kind of pull off like a Shopify in Split 1. In their first regional where they get a top 8, they can make that top 4, but then after that I don't see them getting to top 8 again after that, unless Evo has just improved a ton game sense wise over just a split. But knowing his mentality, I really don't see it.
I agree. I think that pretty much sums it up. There wasn't really anything else crazy that I noticed, except for, did Oli actually get anybody to pick him up before anything closed?
I have
don't.
no
He was
idea.
dropped from Oxygen. I didn't see anything about anybody picking up Oli. I was just curious if you guys had
The
heard
only
anything
thing
about that.
EU I'm noticing right now is potentially Gome to Guild and replace a Stake, which could be very interesting. Gome's a good 1v1 player, but he hasn't been seen in the 3 scene at all. So seeing him replace a player like Stake, that's only confusing me, but that's the only thing EU related. The only other big roster move I see is Hunter for Pioneers. You talked about Super Lucky being replaced here by a Hunter. Like, I know you guys probably don't watch OCE that much.
I thought the Pioneers got dropped by their whole roster.
No, that was their their coach, mental coach, and Super Lucky. They got dropped by the roster.
They just dropped like half of the entire roster.
Yeah, I thought it was the whole roster because it was so many people.
Well, so when I first saw the announcement, like without thinking, I saw Super Lashy and then like 2 other names and like read the announcement. You know when you're like skimming through like Twitter and you're like, dude. So like I just without even reading was like, did they just drop their whole roster? Like what are they doing? And I was kind of thinking it was just KCP just like maybe just bouncing out of Rocket League.
Well, they've done that a lot where they just had this much money to pay their actual roster. So they had like the Beast Mode roster and that switched, and then they had the Kronobi roster, and they couldn't pay that either. So they had to go to OCE. So.
Yeah. To be fair with the Kronobi roster, I do know that I think Wonder Mike in specific was asking for a lot of money, even though he hadn't made it like a regional in like forever. So I do know that. And then with with KCP, I think it was in contract negotiations. They Shopify were just able to pay more, I think, and so they went with Shopify. And then with this new roster with Hunter and everything like that, Super Lucky, I mean, he's very inconsistent. Like, he could pop off and do well, but I'd say he is the most inconsistent player on this team. But Hunter, he's very interesting. He's new. He's a 15-year-old. I mean, coming into this roster, he in his very first regional ever, playing with Sicky and with Mox, two other players that people have known of for the last couple seasons. They got second place in their very first regional. The only teams they lost to were Gremlins in the Swiss stage, who they ended up beating in the quarterfinals, and then they lost to Pioneers in the grand final. So Hunter, very consistent, and he also has some LAN experience. They actually played at the one OCE LAN that's happened over the last couple of years, right before the season started. They did end up losing to placeholders, but that was their first ever tournament as a team, I do believe. So seeing this 15-year-old have LAN experience, very, very confident, very similar to Hawk, if you remember him from DreamHack Montreal with the Chiefs a while ago. But he has a way better mentality by what I hear. So honestly, I could see KCP picking up Hunter, and I could see them. I still think Power will be better just because Fever's the GOAT, but I think Pioneers will be back to being LAN contenders rather than getting swept out.
And that'll be super exciting to see. Yeah, like it's kind of it's I guess demoralizing as like a region just to have like you're like one team, right? It's nice to see these other teams actually come about and actually be able to be at a competitive level like with those bigger teams. Like I guess like Sam was that way for a while until like teams like the club actually started getting to like a competitive level. But yeah, I guess with that we've kind of covered the roster stuff quite a bit. Now, given there was quite a bit of topics to cover, but we can go ahead and start talking about all this bot shenanigans within the community. I don't know if either of y'all have kept up with it, but we have bots playing in the game